Welcome! You're listening to the Uncharted Lancaster podcast, where we explore the hidden histories, forgotten places, and long-buried secrets of Lancaster County. Using modern digital storytelling tools, each episode brings a new piece of local lore to life, revealing the strange, the surprising, and the stories history left behind. Let's begin.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today we are taking a trip to a place that is, well, it's technically a city within a city.
That's a great way to put it.
But the population of this particular city, well, it's entirely silent. We are heading to Columbia, Pennsylvania to explore Mount Bethel Cemetery.
It is a fascinating location. And when you say a city within a city, that isn't just a metaphor for the space it occupies. It's about the sheer density of history packed onto this one plot of land. It operates with its own rules, its own, geography, and honestly, its own timeline.
Exactly. I was looking at the numbers in the research, and they are just staggering. Officially, there are about 10,000 people buried there.
10,000 on the books, yeah.
But some estimates based on, the scarcity of early records and the just chaotic nature of the early frontier suggest the number might actually be closer to 14,000.
Which is a massive discrepancy. I mean, that's not a small rounding error.
It's huge. That's 4,000 missing stories, 4,000 people just unaccounted for in the ledger. And we're talking about a timeline that stretches back to 1730.
1730.
That is decades before the United States was even a country.
It is the oldest continually operating burial ground in all of Lancaster County. So when we look at Mount Bethel, we aren't just looking at a graveyard. We're looking at a cross-section of American history from the colonial frontier to the Industrial Revolution, right through the Civil War and into the modern era. It's all there.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We aren't just going to read names off tombstones. We want to trace the history of this community and really the history of America through the people resting in this specific soil. And let me tell you, the cast of characters we have lined up today is unbelievable.
It really is a remarkable collection of individuals. You have the famous and the infamous, sitting side by side.
I mean, we have a guy who's supposedly carved his own tombstone while he was dying of rabies. Which
is a story that it sticks with you.
It really does. Then we have a woman who is basically a Renaissance woman of the frontier. She was making silk for a queen. We've got Civil War saboteurs known as bridge burners.
A pivotal moment in the war, right there.
And then we have the Victorian families who treated this cemetery like a park, literally having picnics on the graves.
Which sounds incredibly morbid to us today, but we'll get into why that was perfectly normal, even celebratory back then.
Right. So just to ground everyone, our sources for today include excerpts from the book Mount Bethel, 3 Centuries of History and Heritage, articles from Lancaster County Magazine, and a few local newspapers from 2015 and 2021, plus the cemetery's own historical newsletters and records.
So we have a really solid mix of academic research and local on-the-ground history.
Exactly. We have a lot of ground to cover, literally and figuratively. So let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
I want to start with the origins, because this wasn't always one big unified cemetery, was it? When you look at the map, it looks less like a planned grid and more like a puzzle that's been pieced together over time.
No, not at all. It's much more of a patchwork quilt that got stitched together over decades, even centuries. If you go way back to the early 1700s, this area was known as Wright's Ferry. And you had these founding families, the Blunstons, the Wrights, the Barbers. They were English Quakers who came over and settled there around 1726.
And naturally, where you have the settlement, eventually you're going to need a burial ground.
Precisely. It's one of the first pieces of infrastructure a new town needs. The first formal burial ground was established shortly after they settled. It was originally called Old Bethel. But there's this fascinating detail about how it got its nickname, the Old Brick Cemetery.
Oh, I loved this story. This has to be one of the best origin stories for a wall I've ever heard. It involves a shipment of bricks from England.
It does. Samuel Blunston, one of those key founders we mentioned, he wanted to build a proper English-style brick home for himself in the Pennsylvania wilderness.
Ambitious.
Very. And you have to imagine the context here. This is the 1700s. You can't just drive to a hardware store.
You're in the woods. You're surrounded by trees and stone, and you want bricks.
You are in the woods. So to get the kind of bricks he wanted, he had to import them all the way from England.
Which, in the 1700s, is a logistical nightmare. That is a heavy, fragile shipment coming across the Atlantic on a wooden ship. It must have cost a fortune.
An absolute nightmare and a considerable expense, I'm sure. But here is the tragedy and the twist. Blunston died before the bricks actually arrived.
Oh, no. So the house never gets built.
The house never gets built, but the bricks eventually show up, so the community is left with this massive pile of imported English masonry and a decision to make. What do you do with it?
And they decide to build a wall.
They decide to build a wall around the cemetery. In 1746, they enclosed Old Bethel with Samuel Blunston's house bricks.
That is such a poetic, if slightly sad, twist. The bricks meant for his living room ended up enclosing his final resting place.
It really speaks to the unpredictability of life on the frontier. You make these grand plans for comfort and civilization, but the harsh reality of mortality often intervenes.
And that old brick section was just the beginning. That was the first patch on the quilt.
Exactly. As the town grew, you had different religious denominations moving in, and each one needed its own space.
Right, because back then, you were almost always buried with your congregation. It wasn't just about finding an empty spot. It was about, kind of spiritual geography. You rested with your own people.
Exactly. So you see this fragmentation happening on the map of the cemetery. In 1819, John L. Wright conveyed a piece of land to the Society of Friends, the Quakers. That became what is now Section J.
Okay.
Then a few years later, you see plots conveyed to the Presbyterians. That becomes Section K. Then the Methodists get Section L, and the Lutherans get Section M. It was strictly segregated by faith.
So you'd have the Lutherans in Section M, the Methodists in Section L, Presbyterians in Section K.
Yeah.
It's like a map of the Sunday morning social scene preserved in stone.
Very much so. It's a physical representation of the town's social and religious structure. But not everyone had a congregation or the money to pay for a plot within those denominational grounds.
Right.
And that leads us to the section that tells perhaps the most difficult story, Potter's Field.
Yes. This is a crucial part of the cemetery's history. And for anyone who doesn't know, a potter's field is historically a burial place for the unknown or indigent.
Correct. This was the designated area for the poor, those who couldn't afford a plot, and crucially for the African-American population.
Because at the time, they were often denied burial in the white denominational churchyards. Even in death, the segregation persisted.
It's a stark reminder of the social hierarchy of the time. It extended beyond life.
It really is.
And it's also noted in the records that Susanna Wright, who we are absolutely going to talk about much more later, she arranged for Native Americans to be buried in that section as well. So it became this catch-all for the marginalized, the people who didn't fit into the neat brick-walled boxes of the establishment.
So you have these separate little islands of burial grounds, Methodist, Lutheran, Quaker, and the Potter's Field. How did they all get merged into this one entity, Mount Bethel? Because today, you walk in, and it feels like one place, even with the different sections.
It was a gradual process of consolidation, largely driven by a man named John Houston Mifflin. In 1852, he stepped in and created what was called the New or Mifflin Cemetery.
He had a specific design in mind for that, didn't he? A more modern aesthetic.
He did. He was part of a movement. He envisioned this grand three circles design. It was very much in the style of the new rural cemetery movement, which viewed cemeteries as beautiful park-like spaces.
And how much of that design is left?
If you look at the map today, only one of those circles actually exists, that's Section A. But his vision was the catalyst. He wanted to move away from the disjointed, crowded churchyard model towards something more unified and, frankly, more professional.
And that's when the business side of things really starts.
Yes. By 1868, a charter was formed to create a stock company, the Mount Bethel Cemetery Company.
A stock company.
Yeah.
A cemetery. That sounds so strange to us now.
It does, but this was the era where cemetery management was shifting. We were moving away from the old church-run graveyards, which were often overcrowded, poorly maintained, and, running out of space in town centers. The new idea was a necropolis, a city of the dead run, like a proper corporation.
So they formed this company, and then they had to go around and acquire the deeds from all these different churches and entities.
Essentially, yes. They had to absorb all those little islands into the new corporate structure. And the economics of that are fascinating and a little funny when you look back.
How so?
Well, in the early 1900s, the Methodists, the Lutherans, and Presbyterians all transferred their grounds to the Mount Bethel Cemetery Company. And the price for each of those sections, $1.
$1. Just here. Take it off our hands.
Exactly. They were essentially offloading a liability. Maintaining a graveyard is expensive and perpetual. The churches were probably thrilled to have a dedicated company take over the upkeep.
But the Society of Friends, the Quakers, that was a different story, wasn't it?
They held out, or rather, the situation was more complicated. It wasn't as simple as just signing it over.
Why? Were they still actively using it?
Well, part of the issue was that there was no longer an active Quaker congregation in Columbia at that point. So the negotiation became legally complex. Who actually had the authority to sell the land if the congregation was gone?
Okay, so it was a legal mess.
A total mess. It took years from 1919 to 1924 to sort out the title. And instead of $1, it ended up costing the cemetery company over $3,000 to acquire that section.
Wow. That is a massive difference. Inflation didn't hit that hard between 1906 and 1924.
No, it did not. It likely had to do with all the legal fees and the complexity of transferring land from what was essentially a dissolved religious society to a corporation. But eventually, all of these pieces, the old brick, the denominational plots, the Mifflin section, were stitched together to form the Mount Bethel we see today.
And once it was established as this larger, more organized entity, the way people used it started to change. This brings us to the Victorian era. And honestly, this is one of my favorite parts of the research.
You are definitely referring to the Fait en Noir article and the customs of the time. The picnics.
Yes. The idea of having a picnic in a cemetery. Today, if you saw a family spreading out a blanket and eating roast beef sandwiches on top of a grave, you'd call the police. You'd think it was desecration.
You absolutely would. But we have to contextualize this. In the late 19th century, public parks, as we know them, places designed solely for recreation, were rare, especially in smaller boroughs like Columbia.
So the cemetery was the green space. It was the only park in town.
It was the only manicured, park-like setting available. It had trees, paths, beautiful sculptures in the form of monuments, and there was a profound shift in the attitude toward death during the Victorian era.
How so?
It wasn't just about the grim finality. There was a deep, almost romantic sentimentality. You went to visit your ancestors, to feel close to them, to spend time with them.
The source material is so vivid on this. It mentions people bringing fresh fruit, wine, and roast beef. It says, and I'm quoting, sometimes tombstones were used as slab-like tables.
Can you picture that? Using Great-Aunt Mildred's tombstone as your buffet table?
It's just wild. But it was a social event. You weren't ignoring the dead, you were including them in the family gathering. It was a fete, a celebration. The modern Fait en Noir events the cemetery holds now are a direct callback to that tradition.
It was a way of keeping the family, both living and dead, together.
It's such a different relationship with mortality. We try to keep death sanitized and hidden away. They literally invited it to lunch.
And the landscape itself reflected that garden atmosphere. It was designed to be beautiful and welcoming. Although it is worth noting that the landscape has changed significantly over the years.
Oh yeah, the records mention that in recent restoration efforts, they had to remove something like 72 trees.
72, yeah.
Why remove the trees? I thought trees were part of that park vibe.
They are, but over a century or two, trees become a problem for historic stonework. You have roots that can heave and crack monuments from below. You have large limbs that can fall and smash them from above.
So it's a trade-off.
It's a classic conservation dilemma. Do you preserve the historic landscape exactly as it was, or do you alter it to protect the historic artifacts within it? In this case, they chose to protect the stones.
Speaking of history and materials, there is a specific type of headstone mentioned in the sources that really highlights the technology and sort of the marketing of the time. The white bronze.
Oh, right, which is a brilliant bit of marketing because it isn't actually bronze at all.
Not even a little bit.
No, it's cast zinc. The Monumental Bronze Company produced them between roughly 1874 and 1914. They were marketed as a cheaper, more durable, and more modern alternative to traditional stone like marble or granite.
And were they right? Are they actually more durable?
Surprisingly, yes. Massively so. If you walk through a cemetery of that age, look at the marble or limestone from the early 1800s. Acid rain, which wasn't even a concept they understood then, has just dissolved them.
They look like melted wax. The inscriptions are almost completely illegible on some of them.
You can barely make out the dates, if you're lucky. But the zinc markers, because zinc develops this protective carbonate layer, that bluish-gray patina you see on them, they don't rust and they don't dissolve.
They self-seal, in a way.
They do. So you can read a zinc marker from 1880 as clearly as if it were cast yesterday. The details are still incredibly crisp.
That is fascinating. We think of stone as the most permanent thing in the world, carved in stone. But a cheap zinc alloy actually outlasts it.
It's a great lesson in materials science, right there among the graves. It completely challenges our assumptions about what permanence really means.
Okay, speaking of permanence and leaving a mark, I want to move to the section of the outline that gave me actual chills. We need to talk about William Campbell.
The rabies grave. This is perhaps the most famous single story in Mount Bethel. It's legendary.
It's straight out of a horror movie. Let's set the scene. It's the 1750s. William Campbell is a trapper.
A rough life. He's likely living on the fringes of society, trapping along the river. The story, as it's been passed down, goes that his dog got caught in one of his own traps.
Which happens. An occupational hazard. So he goes to release it.
He does. But while the dog was trapped, it had been bitten by a rabid animal. A fox, a raccoon, who knows? When Campbell freed the dog, now infected, turned on him and bit his hand.
And in 1758, a rabies bite is an absolute death sentence. There's no ambiguity. It's a slow, agonizing death sentence.
There was no Pasteur treatment, no vaccine. He knew exactly what was coming. Hydrophobia, the fear of water, fever, hallucinations, agitation, and then, inevitably, death.
And this is where the legend kicks in. The story says that Campbell, knowing he was dying and knowing how he was dying, decided to carve his own tombstone.
It is such a powerful image. A man alone with this horrific disease progressing, trying to chisel his own name into slate before he loses control of his mind and body.
And the physical evidence on the stone itself seems to back this up, right? It's not just a tall tale.
It does offer some really compelling clues. The source describes the stone as having very neatly carved letters for his name and his age. It says, "Here lieth the body of William Campbell, who departed this life May ye 4th, 1758, aged 65 years. Looks professional."
But then there's the artwork, the iconography.
Exactly. Above the text, there's a carving of a hand and a very crude drawing of a dog sitting on its haunches, and the analysis suggests a sharp contrast in quality. The lettering is skilled, well-proportioned. The dog and hand are primitive, almost childlike.
So the theory is that he started it when he was still lucid, carved his name, his age.
Probably. And then, as the disease progressed, as the fever and the neurological symptoms of rabies set in, he tried to tell his story visually. He carved the hand that was bitten, he carved the dog that bit him, but his motor skills were failing him.
The source material has this heartbreaking line. The theory is he was bitten in one hand and used the other to carve the stone.
It's just incredible fortitude if it's true. And there's another detail about the date. The numbers in the date of death, 1758, are described as being ill-drawn compared to the 65 years of his age.
So maybe he didn't even get to finish the date.
It suggests that perhaps he couldn't finish it, that the disease finally overtook him, or maybe someone else had to fill in the final date after he passed away.
The source mentions that if you want to see this today, it's not easy. The stone is small and unassuming.
Yes, it's slate, which can look just like a dark rock if the light isn't right. The ghost tour instructions are quite specific, and I love this. It says you have to bring a bottle of water. You dribble the water over the slate to create contrast, and then, and this is dedication, you have to lie on the grass directly in front of it to see the carvings clearly.
Talk about getting close to history. Lying on the ground to see a story carved by a dying man 250 years ago.
It's a testament to the human need to be remembered. Even in his final agonizing moments, he wanted people to know how he died. He wanted to leave a record.
From one medical horror to another, the cemetery records also give us a window into the smallpox epidemic of 1902.
This gives us a very different glimpse into life and death in Colombia. Smallpox was a terror. It was highly contagious and deadly.
And the rules for burial laid out by the cemetery board were incredibly strict.
They had to be. This was a public health emergency. The cemetery minutes from August 19th, 1902 list the special instructions. First, burials could only take place at 12 Rollo midnight.
Midnight burials. That sounds so superstitious and gothic, but it was purely about isolation, right?
Purely practical. They wanted the streets empty, no bystanders, no potential for spread. The only people allowed to be present at the burial were the doctor and the health officer. No family, no mourners.
That's just devastating for the families. No chance to say goodbye.
It is a completely sterile, lonely end. And the graves had to be 6 feet deep, strictly enforced, and there was a special man employed specifically to cover the graves immediately.
A special man.
Oh.
It sounds so ominous, but it shows how the cemetery wasn't just a place for ritual. It was on the front lines of public health crises.
Absolutely. It was a matter of public safety. The cemetery was a biocontainment facility in a way.
Let's jump forward or backward slightly to the Civil War. Because Columbia wasn't just a bystander in the war. It sat at a crucial strategic choke point.
It absolutely did. The Susquehanna River, or Susquehanna as it's spelled in some historical contexts in the region, was a major barrier. The bridge connecting Columbia to Wrightsville was a critical crossing point.
It was one of the only ways to get an army across the river for miles.
Exactly. And in June 1863, the Confederate troops under General Jubal Early were advancing. They wanted to cross that river, seize Lancaster, and maybe even push on to the state capital in Harrisburg or to Philadelphia.
Right, and this was happening just days before the Battle of Gettysburg.
The timing is everything. The stakes were incredibly high. And this leads us to the bridge burners.
A group of men who did exactly what their name suggests.
On June 28, 1863, to stop the Confederate advance, the Union forces and local militia made the painful decision to burn the Columbia-Wrightsville covered bridge.
And this was not a small bridge. It was a massive, mile-long wooden structure, a huge piece of local infrastructure.
A huge economic asset for the town. Burning it was a massive sacrifice, but it worked. It stopped the Confederate army in its tracks. They couldn't cross the river.
And Mount Bethel is the final resting place for these saboteurs, these local heroes.
Several of them, yes. The sources list men like W. Robert Crane, who was a railroader by trade, John Conklin Lockard, Jacob S. Rich.
There's a note that they know 4 are buried there for sure, but the 5th is uncertain, though he does have a marker.
And it's important to remember these weren't just soldiers following orders in a distant field. These were local men destroying their own town's major link to the outside world to save the region. A very personal act of war.
And the cemetery is just full of veterans from that conflict. I saw a number. Over 400 Civil War veterans are buried in Mount Bethel.
Which is an enormous number for a town of that size. It includes 24 Black veterans as well, which is significant.
It really is.
And there's a prominent monument to General Thomas Welsh. It just shows how deeply the Civil War impacted the specific community. Every Memorial Day, that cemetery must have been absolutely awash in flags.
Now, we've talked about the soldiers and the trappers, but I want to talk about 2 specific people who I think are the intellectual and sort of cultural heart of this deep dive. Let's start with Susanna Wright.
Susanna Wright is, without a doubt, one of the most impressive figures in colonial Pennsylvania history. Full stop.
The source calls her a frontier intellectual. And that feels like a massive understatement.
It really is. She was born in England in 1697, came to the frontier in her 20s, and she never married. She was a spinster by choice, which was a radical decision for the time, but it also gave her the legal freedom as a femme sole to conduct her own business.
And what a business it was. She established the first silk industry in Pennsylvania.
In the 1700s. On the frontier. I mean, think about that. She raised silkworms, thousands of them. She grew the mulberry trees to feed them. She learned how to process the cocoons into raw silk. This is high-level, delicate work.
And there's this great bit of folklore that Benjamin Franklin, who was a close friend of hers, took a piece of her silk as a gift to Queen Charlotte of Britain.
The Franklin connection is very well documented. They weren't just acquaintances. They were genuine friends and intellectual peers. They had a decades-long correspondence. They exchanged books.
And gifts. I love this detail. The source mentions Franklin sent her one of the first thermometers and new types of candles, and she sent him pickled Susquehanna salmon.
It was a meeting of great minds. But beyond the silk and the salmon, she was a poet and a scholar. She was fluent in French and Italian. She studied Native American languages. She was a botanist.
And her poetry wasn't just, flowery nature stuff. It had some real bite to it. It was political.
It did. There is a quote in the source from a poem she wrote to a friend, questioning the laws that kept women subservient to their husbands. She wrote, "But womankind call reason to their aid and question when or where that law was made."
That is incredibly progressive. She's questioning the very foundation of patriarchy in the mid-1700s.
She was a bluestocking, a term for a woman of deep intellect. She acted as a legal counselor for her neighbors. She prepared medicines. She really was the glue of the community in many ways, a true polymath. And she is there in Mount Bethel.
Then we have a figure from a later era, but no less fascinating, Lloyd Mifflin. He's known as America's greatest sonneteer.
Lloyd Mifflin is a tragic but also a really inspiring figure. He was born in 1846. Originally, he wasn't a poet at all. He was a painter, and a very good one. He studied in Europe, Germany, Italy. He had a promising career ahead of him.
But his art literally made him sick.
Yes, the fumes from the oil paints. It's believed the lead and the turpentine damaged his health significantly. He became chronically ill and had to quit painting entirely.
Just imagine that. You spend your life training to be a painter. It's your passion, your identity, and your body rejects it. That's a devastating blow.
It is. So at age 51, he pivots. He completely reinvents himself. He decides if he can't paint images on canvas, he will paint them with words. He dedicated himself to mastering the sonnet.
And he didn't just dabble. The sources say he was obsessive about it.
Completely. He wanted to write the perfect sonnet. He was known as the Hermit of the Hills. He lived a somewhat secluded life, focusing entirely on this very specific, very difficult craft, and he became one of its greatest masters in America.
There is a beautiful tradition associated with him that continues to this day, which I think is amazing.
Yes. This is my favorite part of his story. He donated land for a school in Columbia, but he had a stipulation in the deed. He asked that every year, on his birthday, September 15th, a rose be placed on his mother's grave in Mount Bethel, and one of his sonnets be read aloud.
And they still do it.
Every single year since his death in 1921, students from the school come to the cemetery, place the rose, and read a poem. It's a lovely, living example of how a bequest can keep a memory and an art form alive.
I love that. Okay, so we've covered the people, from the famous to the tragic. Now I want to look at the machinery behind all this, the business of death, if you will, because running a cemetery for almost 300 years isn't free.
No, and the administrative history of Mount Bethel is full of these odd little schemes and harsh realities to keep the lights on, or I suppose keep the grass cut.
I laughed out loud when I read about the rye. I just couldn't picture it.
It's amazing. In 1876, the cemetery had open fields within its boundaries that weren't being used for burials yet. So to make a little extra income, they made a deal with a local man, a Mr. Stemmen, to thresh rye on the property.
Imagine going to visit a grave and there's a guy in the next lot over with a scythe threshing rye.
It shows you how agrarian the town still was at the time. Any open land was potential farmland. The cemetery also acted almost like a bank at one point. In 1880, the company held mortgages on town properties.
On what kind of property?
Including church.
The cemetery owned the mortgage on a church. That is a power move.
It was a business, it had capital, and it invested it. But it could be a very harsh business. There is a minute entry from 1901 that is quite shocking by today's standards. The secretary was directed to send letters to people who were delinquent on paying for their burial lots.
And the threat wasn't just a late fee or a lien.
No. The threat, stated in the minutes, was that they would remove the bodies interred there at the delinquent's expense if the bill wasn't paid promptly.
That is cold. Pay up or we evict Grandma.
I haven't seen any evidence in the sources that they actually followed through on that threat, but the fact that they made it shows you the kind of financial pressure they were under. The necropolis had to balance its books.
And they had law enforcement powers, too. To protect their investment, I guess.
The superintendent was sworn in as a special officer with the power to make arrests within the cemetery grounds. They took security and vandalism very seriously.
But despite all this, despite the mortgages and the rye and the threats, the cemetery eventually hit hard times.
As happens with so many of these old historic cemeteries, in the 20th century, the original stockholding families died off. Their children moved away. The revenue streams from new burials dried up as other cemeteries opened. By the late 1900s, it was in serious decline.
Enter the Ted Miller era, as the sources call it.
Ted Miller seems to be one of those unsung heroes you find in every community. He wasn't even on the board initially. He just stepped up when the last board member had a stroke and could no longer manage things. He was running this massive 10-acre place on a shoestring budget.
How much are we talking?
About $5,000 a year from a trust, plus whatever donations he could get.
That is impossible. You can't even mow 10 acres for a year for $5,000, let alone maintain crumbling 200-year-old monuments.
You absolutely can't, and it showed. The place was becoming overgrown. But then came the turning point, 1994 and 1995.
The Lions Club cleanup.
Yes. The local Lions Club organized a massive volunteer day. Over 100 people showed up to mow and clean and reset stones. It sparked a realization in the community that they couldn't let this historic place just disappear into the weeds.
And the story of the stockholder meeting to formally save it is wild. They called a meeting to reorganize the board of the old stock company.
But nobody showed up. The original stockholders were long dead, or their descendants were scattered across the country and had no idea they even owned a share in a Pennsylvania cemetery.
So how did they legally take it over? It sounds like a legal catch-22.
It was. But they were clever. They had secured a proxy vote from Betty McCachran, who was the widow of the last official board member. She held the only known shares. So, with her single proxy, a small group of volunteers was able to vote themselves in as the new board.
That is a coup, a benevolent cemetery coup.
It saved the place. Now they have a nonprofit, the Friends of Mount Bethel. They hold events like the Ghost Tours and the Fête au Noir to raise the $14,000 or $15,000 needed every year just for mowing.
It brings it all full circle. The Victorians picnicked there because it was a park. Now we hold events and tours there to fund the mowing so it remains a park.
It's a symbiotic relationship between the living and the dead. The stories of the dead help fund the preservation of their own resting place.
So wrapping this all up, what does it all mean? We've looked at the layers: Quaker settlement, Civil War strategy, Victorian leisure, medical horrors, frontier genius.
I think Mount Bethel is a testament to the fact that a cemetery is never just about death. It is about the living community that surrounds it. It reflects our changing values, our changing economy, our changing social structures, and our changing fears.
And it's still active. That's the thing that gets me. This isn't a museum sealed under glass.
No, they have about 8 burials a year. It's still serving its original function. The gates, as board member Jane Moore says in one of the articles, are never closed.
I want to leave our listeners with a final visual. We talked about the limestone markers from the 1700s melting away in the rain like bars of soap.
And we talked about William Campbell's slate, scratched with a crude image by a dying hand.
It's a powerful juxtaposition. We try to carve our legacy in stone to make it last forever. We think stone is the ultimate symbol of durability, but the limestone dissolves. The names disappear.
The material we thought was permanent fails.
Exactly. Yet the story of the man and the rabid dog, that survived. The story of Susanna Wright and the Queen's silk, that survived. The tradition of Lloyd Mifflin's rose, that survived.
It suggests that oral history community memory, the stories we tell each other, is actually more durable than granite. The stories are what truly last, not the stone.
That is a profound thought. So here's my question for you, listening right now. If you were in William Campbell's shoes, if you had 1 hour left and a piece of slate and a nail, what one single image would you carve to explain your life? Not words, just an image. Would it be a tool of your trade, a pet, a symbol of your family, a book?
It forces you to boil your entire existence down to one icon. It's a really difficult question.
Think about that. And maybe go visit a local cemetery. Don't just look for famous names. Look for the unusual dates, the strange carvings, the weathered stones. You might find a story just as wild as the bridge burners or the frontier poet.
There is history under every step. You just have to look.
Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll catch you on the next one.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Uncharted Lancaster podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating or review wherever you listen. It really helps more people discover the show. For more fascinating local history, visit unchartedlancaster.com. And if you'd like to go deeper, check out one of Adam Zern's books at unchartedlancaster.com/books. Until next time, keep exploring.